Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, when it comes down to it, I thought, of course, that I would give my little fight review and my fight analysis on that of the Artur Beterbiev versus that of Callum Smith fight. And there's kind of a lot to talk about within this fight review, not just because of what ended up happening within the fight. And of course, for those of you that did not hear the results, pretty much expectedly, Artur Beterbiev ended up dominating, or at least, very clearly beating that of Callum Smith within this fight, to the point to where eventually he stopped yet again another opponent. And now he's 20 for 20, not just in terms of his unbeaten streak, but also in terms of his knockout percentage. And Artur Beterbiev definitely has to be up there, if not the debate, possibly not even the debatable, but probably the most devastating, dominant fighter on the pound for pound list right now, just at least in terms of punching power. You don't necessarily have to say that, in your view, that he's the most skilled on the top 10 pound for pound list if you don't want to. If you wanted to say that certain fighters like Crawford or Inoue or Fury or Usyk or Canelo are ahead of him, I would understand that. But Artur Beterbiev is still very skilled at what he does. And, a lot of people, they take a look at someone like Artur Beterbiev, and they take a look at this Caucasian Russian fighter, and, at times he does appear a little bit stiff, but I don't see him as a one dimensional fighter. I think that he can somewhat fight in a multitude of ways. Of course, what his main objective is usually going to be is that he's going to try to break you down over time. But he can somewhat fight in a multitude of ways. If he needs to fight on the back foot, then he can. If he needs to break you down over time, and go to the body and try to break you down on the front foot, then he'll do that. Artur Beterbiev is a very devastating fighter, but he's not devastating just because of his athleticism. He's also devastating because he has a great amateur pedigree and great amateur experience. And on top of that, he's a very intelligent fighter. Now, is there certain faults that maybe he has? I would say that, if we're talking about the main fault that he does have, I wouldn't say that he always has the best head movement from what I've seen. I think that at times that he can be a little bit too stiff for his own good, which, can be a problem with some fighters, especially certain European fighters. But at the end of the day, he has enough head movement and he has enough in his tool set and his skill set to where to where overall, he usually has enough against that of his opponents. And let me also state this, because Callum Smith, especially from a lot of the LDBC and new media channels, there's going to be a lot of comparisons and talking about Canelo Alvarez and saying, see, we told you guys that Callum Smith his whole entire time was a bum. Look and see what Artur Beterbiev did to him. And I'm also here to talk about that. I'm also here to talk about my opinion about who Callum Smith is as a fighter. And has my opinion really changed about Callum Smith ever since this fight? No, not necessarily. I think that Callum Smith, once again, when Canelo Alvarez fought him, and also when Artur Beterbiev fought him, I think that Callum Smith in both of those fights, I think that he was an A minus level fighter. I'm not going to call him necessarily a B plus level fighter. Now, if you were to rank him as a B level fighter, then that's up to you. But Callum Smith, at one point in time, he was the Ring Magazine champion of the super middleweight division, and he was looked at least at one point, as debatably the most dominant fighter there. Possibly not the most talented, but at one point in time, he was ranked number one within that weight division. And I'm not necessarily sitting here telling you that I think he's quite as talented as David Benavidez or David Morrell, and maybe some of you don't even believe that he's as talented as Caleb Plant. But the thing, at least at 168, because he probably is a good natural 175 pounder, he looks right in there, right the same size, if not even a little bit bigger, right there with Artur Beterbiev. So, once again, I still count that, just in my view, on Canelo Alvarez's resume, but not just Canelo Alvarez, but as well as Artur Beterbiev's. I count both of those probably as an A minus level win. I don't think that Callum Smith is ever going to be a fighter that is going to be top 10 pound for pound. I don't think that he ever had that level of talent, but he still had great athleticism. He has absolutely amazing power, at least at times when he's able to land it. The problem is with Callum Smith is that he does have a little bit of those British faults to where he's a little bit too stiff for his own good, and at times he needs to learn how to counter and use his feet and get in and outside of the range a little bit more. At times he does get a little bit too stiff and a little bit too brawly for his own good, and that kind of ended up happening here a little bit. So once again, just to talk about that, because there's going to be a lot of talks about the LDBC and new media channels, especially trying to degrade that of the Canelo Alvarez win. In my view, Callum Smith was always an A minus level fighter. And I also thought that he was an A minus level fighter here. I'd consider him an A grade win. I just don't consider him an elite fighter. I think that he's an A minus level fighter because of his athleticism and because of his size. And on top of that, he has somewhat of relative talent. But I don't think that he's an elite fighter. I think that he's a guy that he can beat some very good fighters out there, but he's never going to be a guy that's top 10 pound for pound. He just doesn't have that skill set. He doesn't have that boxing level of IQ. It just is what it is. But I just thought that I would say that because you have to really take a look at a fighter and really decipher whether you think that they're A, B, C grade. And there is such a thing as champions that are B or C grade level fighters. And that's why when I take a look at Gervonta Tank Davis, like a lot of these LDBC and new media channels, I guarantee you they're going to take a look at it and say, oh, well, Canelo Alvarez, he beat a bum and Callum Smith and all that stuff. Well, you can say that all you want to, but at one point in time, Callum Smith, he was a guy that gave certain fighters some very tough fights. And on top of that, he was the super middleweight champion of the world and the Ring magazine champion of the world. All right, that's what he was, and he won a Super 6 Series tournament, not necessarily against the most talented lot, but he still was able to do that. So once again, when it came down to it, I just thought that I would comment on that, and I do consider this another A-grade win on that of Artur Beterbiev's resume, because Callum Smith had never been dropped before. He had never been stopped, even by that of Canelo Alvarez. Now, against Canelo, he probably was that of a light heavyweight fighter, and like I said, Canelo, in my view, is more of a slightly bigger middleweight, if you want to call him that. I don't think that he's really a natural super middleweight, but still, it's very impressive because Callum Smith, once again, has never really shown any signs, I believe, of being knocked down before. And on top of that, being knocked down, and Artur Beterbiev was able to treat him basically just like any of his other opponents. I'll say this. Callum Smith, in my view, did give Artur Beterbiev a little bit of a contest, especially within that of the first 3 to 4 rounds. But in my view, and the problem with Callum Smith, excuse me, the problem with Callum Smith, especially in this fight, is that he fights the wrong type of fight for him. And when you're a guy that's 6'3", and I'm guessing you at least have a 78-inch arm reach, and you have these attributes, you have to use those things. And the problem is with Callum Smith in here is that even though he actually was landing a decent amount of the time against Artur Beterbiev, the problem is that he just doesn't know really how to box to an elite level. He's a guy that, he's probably an A-minus level fighter because of his athleticism, and he knows how to box to a degree, but he doesn't know how to do it intelligently. And you can pretty much see that here because he was way too close a lot of the times inside the range with Artur Beterbiev. You don't want to, if you're the taller guy and on top of that you're the lengthier guy, I understand at times, trying to get in certain exchanges, but he just doesn't have the level of defense, he doesn't have the level of cognizance, nor the level of fight IQ to know really when to counter, at least at all times, and on top of that, he's just staying way too close inside Artur Beterbiev's range. He could have really put him behind the jab, really went to Artur Beterbiev's body because there were times where you could tell that Artur Beterbiev was feeling that level of power from Callum Smith. There were times where he was backing up. There was times where he was a little bit in certain rounds, especially in the second half, where he was kind of on, his bicycle a little bit, or he was kind of stepping back because he could feel that level of power from Callum Smith, and he kind of wanted to reboot and adjust and make sure that he wasn't going to get too hurt. So Callum Smith's, his level of power and athleticism is not the problem. The problem is his level of boxing IQ. And once again, he did not use his jab anywhere near enough. I just don't see any double jabs from him. I don't see a whole lot of setups overall when it comes to blinding his opponent. And that's just really the problem. Callum Smith, he's one of those guys that, he's very talented and he's always going to be a huge threat, especially when he's facing guys that probably are naturally smaller than him. But once he faces guys that probably are damn near the same size as him or his natural weight class, he's going to be in a little bit more trouble. Just like that of Jarrett Hurd, just like that of Paul Williams, certain fighters like that. He pretty much is within that same class. And that's what we've seen tonight. He did give Artur Beterbiev a decent amount of trouble, at least in some of those early rounds. Not necessarily to the point to where I would say that maybe he won any rounds, at least definitively. But at least to the point to where he had Artur Beterbiev backing up at times, and that you could certainly tell that Beterbiev was rethinking some of his plans of attack. But once again, just way too close inside the range, and he just stayed up against the ropes way too long. And I don't care what fighter you are. Against a fighter like Artur Beterbiev, where usually his main plan of attack, you cannot let those guys gain confidence. You cannot let those guys break you down so early up against the ropes. You have to show them, especially very early on, that I'm not going to let you do that to me. You're going to have to really work to get on the inside. I'm going to move around. I'm going to use my feet. And then on top of that, you're going to get some power back at me. But the thing is that Callum Smith he just does not have a great ability, or really, I'm not going to say any ability, but he just doesn't have any great ability, if any ability really, to move in and outside of the range with his feet. He doesn't really have, in terms of feet, he doesn't really have smart feet. And you have to move in and outside of the range with Artur Beterbiev. Beterbiev, I wouldn't say that his feet are the fastest that I've ever seen, but Beterbiev knows how to move in and outside of the range and control range when he needs to. When he needs to get close, he'll get close. When he needs to stay on the outside of the mid-range, he'll do that a little bit. But Callum Smith just has no level of intelligence in that area. He pretty much either get close to you or he'll try to outbox you from the outside, and that pretty much is what makes Callum Smith, to somewhat of a degree, a little bit of a one-dimensional fighter. He's a talented one-dimensional fighter, and once again, especially at the super middleweight division, I would still count him as an A grade level fighter there. But at the light heavyweight division, if you were to say that he's a B grade level fighter, or that he's just a B grade level fighter in general, I can't argue with it too much, because Callum Smith, even though I think he has some level of talent, he clearly is limited in his boxing IQ. It just is what it is. And he just stayed up against the ropes way too long, and he didn't have great counters. You're the bigger guy. When the smaller guy has you up against the ropes, it's not usually going to end up very well for you. It just is what it is. All right? You have to try to get out there. You have to try to use your mid-range. You have to try to use, that overall of your longer reach. And Callum Smith, he has all the physical aspects in the world. he has the power, he has the height, he has the reach. Doesn't have any idea how to use them whatsoever. Doesn't have any idea how to use them whatsoever. And that's a big part of the reason why eventually he started getting broken down incrementally as the fight went along. Because Artur Beterbiev knows how to use his jab better. He knows how to get through the guard. He knows overall how to feint, better than that of Callum Smith. He knows overall how to set up traps and set up counters better than that of Callum Smith. Because, excuse me, Callum Smith, when you take a look at him, even for some of the, especially the physical talent that he has, in terms of his level of boxing IQ, he really only has one or two game plans, and that's to try to outbox you from the inside from the outside, and try to slowly outbox you with the jab, get you with the right, and kind of keep you at a distance. Or if that doesn't work, he's going to try to get you on the inside, hit you with the left, hit you with some body shots, and then after that, that's pretty much all he has. And this was shown in the Canelo Alvarez fight. This also was shown in the Artur Beterbiev fight. So there's no offense against Callum Smith. I still think that it's an A-grade win, an A- level win for both Canelo and Artur Beterbiev. But it's very clear that in terms of the boxing IQ, he just doesn't have it in that department. It just is what it is. He doesn't know how to use his feet. He doesn't have the best of head movement. He doesn't know how to use his attributes to the best of his ability. And he could have made this fight a certain amount more competitive and definitely survived longer had he knew how to use his feet, also by making sure that Beterbiev was not getting too much ground on him by really trying to hurt him, and that sometimes, tying him up, and also making sure that he goes to the body and not staying up against the damn ropes way too long. He had certain success in the mid-range, and he was able once again to have certain success. He was hitting Artur Beterbiev a decent amount of the time, especially in the early rounds, especially in sometimes in the second half of those rounds or the final minutes, but it just wasn't enough. The boxing IQ excuse me, was a lot better by that of Artur Beterbiev. And on top of that, when you're talking about his level of power and his level of conditioning, eventually those punches are going to take their toll, because Artur Beterbiev is one of those type of punchers and one of those type of boxers to where he can even probably only use about 40% of his power or 30% of his power. And after a while, you're just going to feel it, because it's almost kind of like getting hit, by like that of a sandbag after a while. After a while, it feels light at first. it feels light, but then after a while, you're gonna really feel it wearing on you. It just is what it is. After a while, it's just gonna drain you. And that's pretty much what happens with Artur Beterbiev's opponents. Artur Beterbiev, the reason why he's so dangerous is not just because of his boxing IQ, and of course he has power, but he also knows how to use it. But what makes his power so special is that, whenever, even sometimes when he's not putting everything into it with his waist, or, with full shoulder snaps sometimes when it comes down to it, Artur Beterbiev can hurt you even with those, small tapping shots. He can hurt you slightly. You're not going to feel them that much at first, but after a while, especially when he starts hitting you with those harder shots, those small taps, it's almost like that of water torture. Eventually, they're going to feel a lot more powerful as that of the fight goes along, and we've seen that. But this is a very impressive performance by that of Artur Beterbiev. I thought that he looked a little bit more hittable in this fight than what I had seen him in previous fights, but maybe I'm wrong about that. Because it's not like Artur Beterbiev in my view. It's not like it's not like he's ever had the best hand movement that I've ever seen. That probably is the only main fault that I see in Mr. Beterbiev. But Beterbiev definitely is an A-grade level fighter. He's one of the best champions in the world, and he certainly makes my top 10 pound for pound list. And some people also would debate that he could be a top 5 pound for pound fighter. I'm not quite sure if he would make my top 5 pound for pound, but he certainly would be anywhere within that 8 to 6 range, somewhere around there. Maybe just making my top 5 pound for pound list if I really looked at it. Which, by the way, I'm going to have to release that in my top 5, or excuse me, my top 10 pound for pound list very soon, because of course it is the new year. But that's pretty much, what I have to say about this. I think that this is once again a very good win by that of Artur Beterbiev. I think that Callum Smith tried his best, but his best once again is never going to be good enough against a creme de la creme, because Callum Smith is not a creme de la creme fighter. He's an A- level fighter, in my view, but he's not a creme de la creme fighter. So whenever he fights someone like a Canelo, a Beterbiev, a Dimitri Bivol, a David Benavidez, possibly we'll see where he goes. If he fights anyone like that, he's not going to beat him, because that's not what Callum Smith is. Callum Smith, once again, is a guy that is meant, to kind of lose some of those bigger matchups. Almost kind of like a Victor Postol, where if you wanted to debate him as an A- level fighter at one point in time, you certainly could. But he's kind of tipping, he's kind of between that line between a B plus and an A- level fighter. You don't really know how actually good that he is. So I understand certain people depending on the opinion, but I still think that this is a very good win. Beterbiev has wins over that of Joe Smith. He has wins over Callum Smith. He has wins over Marcus Brown, Alexander Vozdik. I believe, and I think there might even be another name on there that I'm forgetting. Anthony Yard, and there's some other ones. But of course, the fight that we all want to see is the Dimitri Bivol fight. So we'll see where that goes. And, excuse me, that's going to be a very interesting fight. Because if either one of those fighters is going to lose, it's going to be because of what either one of those fighters and their styles bring to the table. Bivol, I think in order to beat him, I think you're going to have to try to break him down incrementally. And I think overall that you're going to have to try to really beat him up against the ropes, just in my personal view. But that's also going to be interesting because Bivol does have good power. And on top of that, in my view, he's quicker with both his hands and his feet. And he utilizes more movement than that of Artur Beterbiev, But we'll see. That'll be interesting. But as for Beterbiev, we all know that he has great levels of power. And it would be very interesting to see if he could break down Dimitri Bivol, or at least get him to the point to where he would beat him, to the point overall to where Dimitri Bivol would eventually cave in. That's really a very interesting fight, and I'm not quite sure who I would predict to win in that fight. It's really a very intriguing fight because both Dimitri Bivol and Artur Beterbiev, they bring certain things to the table where they might have advantages over that of the other, and they might actually have the perfect type of style to counter each other to make the other fighter lose. It's just really going to depend who is better and overall whose flaws show out worse within that fight. So it's going to be very interesting. A lot like that of the Crawford and Spence fight. But it's going to be very interesting. Anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see where Mr. Artur Beterbiev goes next. Hopefully we get to see that Dimitri Bivol fight. That would be a lovely fight to watch. But anyways, that's pretty much about it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you all later.